Good morning and good afternoon for some of you. I'm Liz Ecker with Senior Housing News, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about the critical steps involved in creating a successful senior living development project. Just a couple of small housekeeping items before we begin. Phone lines have been muted for sound quality, and we will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to type in your questions as you have them using the question box on your screen at any point during the presentation. We'll get to as many of them as possible during the last part of the hour. Today's webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent via email as a follow-up, so please look out for an email coming in the next day or so with instructions on how to download the recording and materials. A big thank you to Plante Moran Living Forward for bringing this webinar to us today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panel briefly. Today, we will be hearing from Dana Wolfslager, who is a principal with Plante Moran Living Forward. We'll also hear from Joe Hassel, a principal with Perkins Eastman, and Jamie Tomadio, VP with Plante Moran Living Forward. And I'd like to turn it over to Dana at this point.
Thanks, Liz. Appreciate it. Good afternoon and good morning for those of you on West Coast time. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're excited about sharing this webinar with you and talking through some of the opportunities to get projects right if you're considering a new senior living development project. And very specifically, we really want to talk about some of the ways to simplify the project by really embracing a team concept, identify ways to mitigate and minimize risk, maybe even reduce some of the costs associated with doing a project, certainly reduce time, energy, and manpower and brain damage along the way, because they can be pretty complicated from time to time. And then we really want to talk as well about how to learn to develop a collaborative partnership and a collaborative approach, which really gets all of the team members that are involved in the project in alignment. If you have alignment, the likelihood of a successful project is far greater. So the key takeaways hopefully will be, if you use the right process and you bring the right people to the table, you will generate the right results by and large. The 5 critical development considerations that we're going to focus on today, and we do have some specific case studies or project examples of how they went sideways because these principles and considerations weren't followed. The first one is we really want to talk about the financial feasibility to the extent that everybody, before they even consider a project, should be asking themselves, what can you afford to build? And shockingly, not enough people ask that question early in the process and get too far down the road and find themselves having to start over. Number 2, we want to uncover some of the unknowns. There's a lot of inexperienced owners and developers getting into this space, and if you don't know what you don't know, it's going to make the project a lot more difficult. We're going to recommend assembling the right team, and we're going to talk through specifically who those team members should be and when you should have them at the table. We want to talk about how to evaluate the development process. The timeline is not linear, and so we want to talk a little bit about the parallel paths that you should be traveling on. And then probably the most important piece of this is really talking through the specifics relative to the different delivery methods, because that will help drive the project, mitigate risk, and a lot of other mistakes that may come along the way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jamie.
Thanks, Dana. Hello, everyone. Jamie Tomadio here at Plante Moran Living Forward. We wanted to start briefly before we get too far into the presentation and just kind of laying some foundation of how much construction has happened over the last several years, and then where do we see. Obviously, we know there's a lot of baby boomers coming into the senior living space in the next several years, and so how do we see that impacting the overall demand for future senior living development? And so what we have here is a slide outlining over the last 3 years how many new properties were added within the senior living space in the top 100 metropolitan areas in the United States. And you can see on the left there, the teal bluish color represents about 65% of the total new properties that have been built. So in the last 3 years, there have been 992 properties built. 65% of those 992 have been built by organizations who have 2 or fewer properties that they currently own or manage. So there's a lot of new entrants, new players coming into the space potentially that are making a pretty big waves in a lot of different markets across the United States. Out of that 992, about 186 of those properties, or 19%, were by organizations that had 10 or more properties, and the balance, about 16%, were made up of organizations who owned or managed 3 to 10 properties. So there's been obviously a ton of new development over the last 3 years. This particular slide is looking at what has gone on dating back to 2008 and looking at prior to recession numbers up to through 2017. And what we find interesting is 2008 was obviously a very strong year for senior living. It was starting to, there was a lot of development. 2009, the recession began happening, and you still had 20,000 or so independent, assisted, and memory care units added to the overall top 100 markets in the United States. Then the recession happened, we dipped down to 12,000. What's interesting is you fast forward to 2015, 16, and 17, and we're well above 20,000 new units coming online in the overall 100 top populated markets in the United States. This past year, in 2017, was the first time we topped over 30,000 new units being added. What's interesting about this graph is a couple things. One, if you look at nursing home, if we were to add nursing home beds to this particular slide, every single one of these years, except for 2, there was actually a reduction in nursing home beds in service. So the housing space, independent through memory care, is really seeing a robust growth period. Nursing home beds are obviously struggling occupancy-wise, as I think many of us are aware of, and they're being repositioned potentially as assisted memory care beds in a lot of organizations that we're working with. The other thing that's interesting to note on this particular slide is if you were to look at the existing inventory for assisted living, 20% of that inventory that is currently in operation today was added over the last 5 years. So there's obviously been a ton of new assisted living product added to the market.
And Jamie, what's important about this slide is with that kind of growth, you really have to figure out how to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. It can't be the same cookie cutter approach. We're going to talk about that a little later, but this graph indicates how important that is to address how to become unique in the market.
Yep, absolutely. Slide 8, no surprise, I don't think to many of us, is really kind of just illustrating the growth of the baby boomer population. The numbers represented on this bar chart are represented in millions, and you can see that orange line represents our baby boomers over the age of 75. From 2020 to 2060, the growth of them and where we expect those total numbers to be. Obviously, a lot of baby boomers are the oldest one currently today is only 72 years old, and we have a lot of these individuals obviously coming into the senior living space. Many of us are aware that the average age of a resident moving into a senior living product tends to be in 84 roughly for an assisted living product, and independent is pretty close to that as well. So there will be a lot of individuals over the next 10, 20, 30 years that will be in that threshold of 80 plus to be potentially moving into our senior living product. So what we wanted to do is we said, take a particular market, and in this example, we looked at Indianapolis, and we're trying to figure out how many new units do you need, the market of Indianapolis need to add for senior living products. So when we're talking about that, we're looking at independent and assisted living. And currently they're at 10,957 units in their particular MSA. Of that, if you were to take that percentage and you looked at the number of seniors over the age of 65 for Indianapolis and figured out what that current penetration rate was, and we applied that with the growth of the 65 plus population through 2050, if the market of Indianapolis maintained that same penetration rate, the market would need to add roughly 8,000 additional beds to grow to close to 19,241 units by 2050. So there's many factors that obviously can go into this. Senior's choice, where do they want to live? Will they live in a senior living setting, or will the home and community-based services play a much bigger role? But if it were to remain the way it is operating today and the same utilization factors are happening, you really can see it for a market. Indianapolis alone needs to add roughly another 8,000 units to their inventory. So let's move on to consideration number one that Dana outlined. And our first piece is the financial feasibility component. What can you afford? And the way we look at this is to make sure when you approach any project, before any drawings happen, before any analysis happens, obviously you need to know where you're doing a potential project, but then the next most critical point is what can you afford? If you're an existing operator out there and you need to utilize some of your existing balance sheet or income operations from other operations, how much can you utilize from there and what can you afford to build? If you're building something brand new and it's a greenfield project, what will pencil out to make sure that the capital stack that you'll put into place for your development project makes sense and ensures that the project we're building is affordable? Because the most important thing we want to do is when we have our friends like Joe get involved and start drawing, they're drawing something that realistically will be feasible and can be built in the next year or two as we're working through that development process. And so the first step in our eyes is really to make sure that we're not getting out in front of our skis and getting too far down the road to see what does a project look like. And first we kind of want to get very, very high level, what can pencil out on paper. And so we outline that. Obviously on this slide we kind of walk through what a debt capacity would look like. That's really that very, very early on stage where we're looking at first how much debt do we want to take on for a project. Some organizations are lucky enough where they can fund many up to 100%. Nonprofit organizations can often fund 100% of their operations through debt or the building construction through debt. Others, for-profit entities, tend to be much more reliant on loan-to-value calculations, loan-to-cost calculations. And so figuring that out up front, figuring out how much equity needs to come to the table, if there needs to be some sort of fundraising campaign, all of those items would need to be figured out from a how do you price your product from the capital stack, what does it look like from the unit mix, how does it pencil out from rent and staffing and all other expense operations, and then figure out does it have the proper return on investment that you as the owner operator are looking for. One of the things that tends to come up very frequently when we're working with many of our clients is the first thing they always ask is, okay, we're looking to do call it 100-unit independent and assisted living building, and how much does that cost? And you'll hear people give construction cost numbers, often by per square footage, and they'll say, construction for that particular product is $190 a square foot. And in our eyes, there's two major components to think through when you're looking through a construction project. And we often want to think through what is your all-in number and not just your true hard cost number, because at the end of the day, you're going to need to fund and pay for your all-in number. So many times people will give you that hard cost construction number, that 180 I just mentioned, maybe related to strictly building your bricks and mortars and physically constructing the building. You then need to furnish the building with your FF&E. You may need to acquire land if you don't already own it. And then there's a lot of other costs like soft costs to pay for architects, pay for banking fees, pay for your lawyers, pay for any other consultants that you may engage throughout the process of the project. All of those costs are making up your all-in cost. And oftentimes those soft costs that really make up everything outside of that green bar in this graph can range anywhere from an additional 20 to 30% on top of your hard cost number. And thinking through that and understanding that early on is critical, because many times folks will be penciling out and making sure that they're financially modeling out the project, looking at strictly a hard cost number, and then when they start bringing on their additional team members, an architect, they start bringing on other consultants, they start talking to bankers, all of these extra fees start getting added to that cost, and a project could potentially become no longer feasible if they haven't thought through the all-in number up front. So the case study we wanted to walk through is a client that was thinking or looking to do a new development project. They're in a state where assisted living beds were undergoing the certificate of need process, and they had the ability, or actually had been awarded by the state, licenses to build a brand new assisted living building. They were currently operating a nursing home campus, and they had some HUD buildings on their property as well. And so what they did is they actually took roughly the appropriate process, and they went through and they figured out how much can they afford to build on their campus. And at the beginning of that exercise, they realized that they could build that assisted living campus at $16 million. And at that point, they executed a contract and had an architect begin drawing their drawings. They had a general contractor begin getting pricing from subcontractors, and they were moving down the road of assuming that the project would be roughly $16 million all in. One of the major issues that they never got full approval from with their board was if they were willing to actually build a project for $16 million. And they got to, was it about 50% drawings?
No, it's even more than that, 80%.
80% drawings, where there was a ton of time from the architect in the project. There was a ton of time from the construction manager engaged on the project, and many subs had been working and giving bids on where they thought these fees would come in at. At the end of the day, the board was only comfortable spending $8 million on the project. And it was an example of the management team trying to shield information and in a sense, kind of micromanage the entire process and not be forthcoming with everybody and having everybody aware of what was going on. And you find out information in bits and pieces throughout the entire example. And what was unfortunate is they could very well have built a $8 million project, and it could have been very successful, but they had burned many bridges by not being upfront and saying the most we'd be willing to take on was $8 million, and telling their architect to only draw an $8 million building. All along, they had been giving them the information to move forward with a $16 million project.
Mm-hmm. So the next consideration we want to visit about is inexperienced owners and developers. And it's interesting. I mean, if you go back to the earlier slide that Jamie was focusing on the total number of individuals or new units and apartments and communities that were developed since 2014, 65% of those new entrants into the marketplace were organizations and operators and owners that had 2 or fewer properties. Which does lend itself to some great opportunities, but I also suspect that there will be a number of properties in the coming years, the very near future, that really didn't do so well, because you've got organizations, individuals, owners, operators that are a little less experienced in this space. And I don't just mean from a development standpoint. There's a lot of really good operators that maybe aren't as savvy developers. There's also a lot of really good developers that don't quite appreciate that this is a healthcare business wrapped in a real estate bow. They come to the table, the developers will come to the table only focusing on the development piece and forget that everybody needs to have a seat at the table that understands development, senior living architecture, how to build these projects, how to operate these projects, the clinical components. Everybody needs to be at the table. And so what we're trying to suggest as a part of this consideration is you need to uncover the unknowns. Wisdom is actually knowing when you don't know something, okay? And making sure that you're reaching out for those individuals to help you along the way. I thought this was a really, really interesting slide, and my mother always used to say, stick to your knitting, in that do what you're good at. Did not realize that Simon Campbell would also used to say that. But I thought this was a really good visual. You know, when you think about all of the things things you don't realize you don't know, that is a massive amount, right? And the things that you actually do know is a pretty small sliver. And so again, recognizing that you need to get the right people at the table to help you be successful is absolutely critical. I'll give you a great example. This is a case study. This is a client that we worked with a number of years ago, and they were actually hotel guys. There's a lot of people, hotel owners and operators, that want to get into the senior living space, and to a certain extent it does make some sense, right? Senior living has a very significant hospitality component to it, but it's not the only component to it, right? There's a whole lot of other elements that drive the senior living operations. And so these guys thought, well, we know real estate, we're pretty good at development, we're also really good hotel operators. That seems to be a good mix for developing senior living. They went out, they actually purchased a site, they hired an architect, put about $300,000 into doing documents. They wanted to develop a senior living community that was all memory care, and they were gonna do memory care in the 4 stages of dementia, where residents are moving through that memory loss continuum, and they would move the residents around. What was very interesting, by the time we got involved, they had already taken the set of documents and started getting some preliminary pricing from construction managers or general contractors. And one of the general contractors that we have the opportunity to work with quite a bit said, have you talked to an operator? Have you talked to anybody about whether this project is really financially viable? And they said, well, we think it's financially viable, but we'll go ahead and talk to someone. Well, we started meeting with them, and the first thing that was abundantly clear to me is the design was not that good. They chose not to use. They used a hotel individual and not somebody who understands the senior living space. We were able to easily cut about 8,000 square feet out of the building because it was not designed properly for that memory care resident. They also, when we started working with them, we also asked them, from a regulatory perspective, if they could do what they even wanted to do. This community was being developed in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And the owner said to us, well, what do you mean, can we do it? We know there's senior living out there. I said, yeah, I know there's senior living, but can you do memory care in an assisted living environment? Can you move residents through this full memory loss continuum the way you have it programmed? And they said, well, we don't know. And I said, well, let me do some research on the regs and get back to you. Well, it turns out at that time, and this was several years ago, but at that time, the regulations in assisted living were such that if a resident needed 24-hour hands-on care that required RN assistance, they had to be discharged to a skilled nursing environment. And the regulations were such that because an RN was the only one, or a licensed LPN was the only one that was able to pass medications, the regulations considered that 24-hour care. And the minute a resident needed medication management and assistance, they had to be discharged to long-term care. So I went back to these owners and said, well, here's the regulations, and it turns out you really can't do what you want to do. And then they said to me, well, do you have any good news? And I said, yeah, the good news is you didn't build a $18 million building only to not be able to fill it. So understanding all of the elements tied to the market conditions, the regulatory environment, the code compliance, design, standards, all of those pieces are absolutely critical, and no one person can have all of those answers, and recognizing who your partners are early on is really, really important. Because again, again, this is where we would highly recommend, and we used owners representatives in certain circumstances in my previous life on the provider side. The whole point of getting into development is to create an opportunity that's successful, but doing development and doing new projects is inherently fraught with risk. And so having a partner with you at the table to mitigate risk, avoid risk, help you insure risk and transfer risk is absolutely critical. Jamie, if you want to move to the next slide. And so, this is a slide that we will share often with our clients. Again, having come from the provider side, I get that every day, operating a community can feel like hair on fire. There's beds that you got to fill. You can't fill third shift. Somebody stole narcotics. The elevator broke down for the 38th time. And so, so often we try to save money and not bring the right team members to the table because we just figure we can pile on more onto our administrator or our ED. And what ends up happening is that leadership, that individual or that team of leaders winds up taking their eye off the operations ball. And bad things can happen very, very quickly if you don't have someone helping you. And so what this would suggest is that, if you choose to be your own owner's rep, you are going to be doing all of those pieces that are in the centers tied to strategic planning and communication with vendors and risk management, code compliance, construction management, understanding all of the legalese tied to the contracts. And you are also going to be that immediate response to the architect, the contractor, and the many, many different sub-consultants that are going to be on the team, including investment bankers, maybe kitchen consultants, landscape consultants, whether you need to go through entitlements, all of these other pieces. You are running a business and you're being all of those things to all of those people. That is very, very difficult and oftentimes leads to missteps and certainly some failures. What we're suggesting is to take more of a formal approach and to have someone there representing your interests through the entire process. It's an independent third party that can manage the process, but is looking out for your best interest. They know what questions they ask. They know what to anticipate in terms of problems. They can see around the corner before it even happens to know because they do it every single day. And so that's what this slide is really representing, is really trying to get the right people at the table very early on to help you manage and mitigate risk.
So consideration number 3 is really assembling the right team, and getting the right team will ultimately save you time and money in the long run. As you begin to assemble your team, it is important to think about the organizational structure of the team. You really want to avoid your team members working in silos. Everybody talking together and sharing insights. Frequent and consistent communication becomes critical to the project's success. Next slide. So how do you do this? It's really breaking down those silos and allowing the team members to function as one unit, making certain that there's frequent and consistent communication, that you document everything, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, team members change throughout the course of a project. Some of these projects can last, depending upon the scale, 5, 6, 7 years. So there's team members that change. 3, it allows you, if you start to question things during the process at different phases, it allows you to go back and clearly understand why decisions were made or why directives were given. Then the clear establishment of defined roles and responsibilities allows you to establish accountability to your team members. What are the deliverables? What is the schedule? What is the budget? And make sure that everyone's meeting those expectations.
I think the one thing I would add too on this slide is we're talking about getting everyone assembled very early on in the process.
Correct.
And it doesn't necessarily mean you're paying them all on this process. Your banker, it's not somebody you're paying. If you're bringing in other consultants, maybe just making them aware that you're thinking through a project that's coming up down the pipe, and you're going to keep them updated over the next 4 or 5 months so that when it does come time to loop them in, they're ready to hit the ground running, and they may throw up a red flag as you keep them in the loop throughout the process. And you don't start moving 2, 3, 4 months down the road, and then you bring in another entity member, and they say you can't do it, move forward because of X, Y, Z, like the example that Dana walked.
But sometimes, even if it is a small fee associated with having someone like, a marketing consultant at the table, or a team member, whether it's an owner's rep or an outside consultant doing the financial feasibility studies, or the architect coming to the table early on, some of those fees very early on will save you a tremendous amount of fees later on in the process if you don't have everyone working collaboratively from the beginning.
Yeah, you cannot over communicate.
Exactly.
On projects. You absolutely need to have everybody talking to each other.
And so it's critical, to foster innovation, and the reason why I mentioned Jamie's slide earlier with the 31,000 units coming online is that with increased competition, you really need to be a leader from an innovation standpoint. And it's your responsibility, the team's responsibility, to be innovative and promote innovation. You know, I like Steve Jobs' quote, where innovation distinguishes between a leader and a follower. You want to be a leader. You want to stand out from your competition. And the value characteristics of whether it's a design team member, like Perkins Eastman or Plante Moran being the owner's rep, is really based on experience, understanding the industry trends, what's happening, market drivers, financial drivers, operational drivers, making certain that you have a pulse on all these things from the very beginning. The importance of convergence. Dana was talking about the hospitality client. We know that senior living has strong convergence with hospitality, mixed use, housing, and healthcare. And there's things that we can abstract from all those markets and apply to ours to make certain that we are leaders and innovators. Obviously, the importance of partnerships, strategic forward thinkers that avoid cookie cutter approaches and one size fits all strategies, and really look at how to uniquely custom tailor the ultimate end result to your specific brand and goals. And obviously, collaborators and active listeners. So a case study on innovation I just want to talk about is the Elysian residences. Before we were even able to put pen to paper, as Dana was saying earlier, this group challenged all the team members that were assembled extremely early in the process to look at how to reinvent the traditional senior living model, and specifically addressed what next generation resident influencers are expecting. And for instance, went around the table and asked, well, what would it take for you to move into an environment in senior living? You as a provider, what would it take you to move in as the CEO and president of the organization? Looking at the staffing models and reinventing those, amenities within the community, the partnerships that may be established to really get you to that next level of thinking, the scale, the project, and the levels of care, or the reinterpretation of the levels of care. Having the right people that can challenge each other and talk about these key components allowed us to start to look at a really unique, innovative way of creating a model for the Elysian company. And these are just a couple examples of, these are 4 or 5 projects we're working on simultaneously, of the result of that process is really looking at a boutique development that is in the heart of specific neighborhoods that allows for aging in place. It's IL focused with assisted living, a floating assisted living license that again allows the resident to age in place, with a very small club amenity space that really looks at partnerships within the community to bridge that gap and foster intergenerational connectivity. The next slide is really talking about how to reinvent what the common amenity space is. We spend a lot of money on developing dining environments that sit empty certain portions of the day. How do we, and it costs a lot of money per square foot, how do we reinvent those to be active, interactive spaces that all day long can be utilized, where we look at the uses, the staffing models, the types of interaction and resident use that can take place, and the unique partnerships that really set it apart and get the biggest bang and return on investment.
So the next piece that we want to focus on is really talking about the actual timeline. Development, unlike other processes, is not a linear timeline. It is very, very dynamic. There are a million parts and pieces that are going on all at the same time. And so if you think you're going to go into a particular project or a development and you're going to go through this, well, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, you will take side steps and maybe even miss some things along the way and have to take 10 steps back. And so understanding the process and breaking it down into manageable pieces is really going to be critical. And the greatest recommendation is to make sure that you have enough stopping points and frequent go and no-go checkpoints in order to mitigate and manage risk. So this is, I think, sometimes how people feel like the process should go. So the owner and the developer maybe, finds the land and then maybe thinks, well, let's go ahead and hire an architect. And then, maybe we should talk to somebody about financing the project. And once we figure out how we might be able to finance it, we'll go ahead and get a contractor to price it out and we'll start construction. The reality is that the process really looks more like this. And it's kind of like a mashed up spaghetti dish of all these noodles going in a whole lot of different directions. But The point is that you want to try and get them all moving in the same direction on multiple parallel paths, all working and communicating together. Because if you don't do that, you will end up you'll take 5 steps forward and 10 steps back. If you aren't making sure that all of these folks are in sync together, I can guarantee you'll end up redrawing. I can guarantee you might have something be overpriced, and then you either need to find more money or you'll have to cut back on your budget. There are a number of things that could certainly derail a project, and doing it linear in nature is going to derail it for you.
And before you get to the end result, or going through that funnel for the end result, that spaghetti line process is meant to have a variety of go, no-go tests throughout it, so that you're actively testing the project throughout the process to make certain you're saving time and money in the end result. And the next slide really talks about our ideas process that we've implemented many times with Plante Moran collectively as a team. We talk about the integration between design, economics, and assessment to create a strategy. And it's really an interactive, transparent process involving the entire team from inception to completion, and that's what's critical. The next slide. And in doing so, you develop an understanding of the parameters and what becomes key in that process. It's really getting the opportunity to get the full team together early on so we can be proactive as opposed to reactive, asking, again, the right questions very early in the process, defining the goals and determining the concerns of all the constituents moving forward. Recently, we were at an interview where the contractor was actually selected before the architect, and the contractor was at the interview table and asking key questions of us on, how would we address this? How will we share information on cost budgeting and concerns and so on and so forth? It was a very fresh, dynamic process. You're defining the budget early on, making sure that we're understanding what the budget is, and reverse engineering from the very beginning what the project can be. Understanding that programming is a critical part, and that certainly there's the big conceptual program that's developed very early on, but the detailed programming has to occur before you even put pen to paper to understand what is needed for the project to make it successful, and test it then very early on and often. Mm-hmm. Again, that was repeated there, but then the flexibility and convertibility in design and functionality really addresses, like I was talking about earlier, how to get the biggest bang for the buck in key spaces like the dining rooms that I mentioned earlier within the space, and looking at alternate uses throughout the day. So from a development standpoint, Project X, I'm not going to say the name of this one, was a RFP for master planning services that we received. And it looked like all the ducks were in a row. They had outlined in the RFP what the scope was, what the budget was. They outlined that they had plenty of debt capacity. They had ability to fundraise for additional cash, and so on and so forth. Next slide. Once we won the project, we got hired, and at the first meeting, we started asking key questions to articulate how certain components were. Where is the financial feasibility study? We'd like to dive into it as even the architectural team member, understand the components of it, understand the marketing feasibility, and only to find out that it was a very cursory kind of analysis that was done at the time. And we said, wait a minute, stop, put on the brakes. You need to assemble the right team. And it was a risk for us because we could have lost the job, but the point being is that no one wants to take on a job that's not going to be successful. And it's important to have that, again, that right team present. So obviously, we mentioned how the client, it was important to have all the constituents present, us and the local architect, the zoning attorney, civil engineer, landscape came on later. But more importantly, partner with teams like Plante Moran, where they came in and did an in-depth financial feasibility study and worked with the market research and feasibility team that they had in place to really assess the depth of the market and what are the tools necessary to make the project a success. So once we had the client, once we were able to develop the team, we made certain that everyone was there. And what was interesting about it is that there were 101 questions that were being asked. And because we had the whole team there, we were able to really listen and understand from all stakeholders what was important to the project moving forward. So when we looked at the process, it started off with understanding the current position, which we had to take many steps backward and do the research that was important to make the project move forward. We talked about, again, what was going to set them apart, the industry trends, and what early adopters are doing and their viewpoints in the industry. We had visioning sessions with all the stakeholders to position for success. And then we jumped into concept master planning. All that happened first before we even started talking about programs, how to prioritize spaces, and then testing those alternatives with bubble diagrams to get a financial budget established, cost estimate to get to a go, no-go. Then we modified that process or that end result and retested it to get to another go, no-go, and then monitored the timeline, schedule, status, and feedback from the team members. And then at that point, and only at that point, did we finalize the master plan, where actually then we started the architectural in-depth review and interiors review to get to the next go, no-go. And then after that, got into the basic services. And this is just looking at it from the goggles of our side of the business, the architecture, interior design side, and master planning. But certainly there's many steps in between this that Plante Moran would look at in the process that makes a great development process. Next slide. So this just starts to show the examples of what happened as an end result. This is the existing community historic building and the repositioning of it as we move forward that really allow them to remain marketable now and in the future and meet the expectations of the consumers. Next slide, these are some additional spaces. And then lastly, the team and the development team does not only consist of people like Plante Moran and Perkins Eastman. It also can include residents and potential residents. And what was important here is that we met with residents through a survey and found out what was important to them from a culinary standpoint. Did the survey, did the research, and actually visited the restaurants that they loved historically throughout their lives and mirrored that kind of feel and aesthetic within the spaces that were created to win the success not only of the current consumer, but also the future consumer.
I think that's a really good point too, Joe. Our industry historically has been pretty paternalistic, and we're morphing out of the skilled nursing environment, but we've spent, an entire generation of residents telling them what to do, where to go, when to eat, when our activities.
We know best. Yeah.
We know best, very paternalistic. And so, taking the time to actually listen to the people that are going to be using the spaces is a very, very important component to this. So the last consideration that we really want to focus on, and quite frankly, I think is probably the most important, it's entirely possible we should have started with this one, but is probably the most important thing we'd like to leave you with today, and that is when you're going into considering the development of any particular project, the question that you should be asking yourself is, what is the type of delivery method that we want to use on this project? Defining the delivery method for the specific project is going to drive everything tied to the project. It will drive schedule, it will drive cost, it will drive contracts, it will drive risk, it will drive an understanding of the market knowledge, it will drive the owner's resources and the capabilities that you should bring to the table. It defines very specifically when parties need to become engaged. It defines the roles and responsibilities and influences the ownership of a project. I will tell you that having come from the provider side, both of the organizations that I had the privilege of working for, we did a lot of development, and in spite of ourselves, we were actually successful, but there could have been a lot of significant missteps. And I will tell you, in 20 years of doing development prior to joining Plante Moran, we never asked the question, what should be the delivery method? The two groups that understand delivery methods the most are architects and general contractors. And, as much as all of those guys are friends of ours, I don't think we do as good a job explaining what the delivery method is. So let's talk about that. Like I said, the delivery method is really going to drive a lot of the decisions that need to be made very early on. And why does it matter? Why does the delivery method matter? Well, if you look at this particular slide and you look at the graph, the x-axis on the bottom is really focusing on time and how much time these particular projects take. And the y-axis, will define how much you have an ability to control a particular project. And so when you look at that in the very, very beginning, the cost influence, your ability to control cost is extremely high when you're in the very beginning. But the further you get through the design development process, the less you're able to control and influence the costs associated with this project. And so, now the cost of construction, conversely, on the scale here is very low. You can't control the cost of construction in the very beginning because, we haven't defined what the project is. But if all of these two things come together, you are in a better position to manage your resources appropriately. And so when you look at the next slide, these are the critical questions. There's three very important questions that you should be asking yourself as it relates to what delivery method is most appropriate for the project that I'm considering. So the three questions are: what type of project delivery method should we use? What will be the procurement method that we should use? And what form of contract are we going to use? Depending on the type of delivery method you're going to choose, that will define your procurement method, and it will define really the contracts that need to be in place. And equally as important is making sure that you're marrying the right contract with the architect to the right contract with the general contractor. Those elements then become the driver for managing the majority of your risk through this process, identifying who you're going to transfer the risk to, and how those things all work in tandem. Were you going to say something, Joe?
No, I was just going to say, oftentimes when some of the more successful projects we've been involved with collectively as well as individually are those that bring a construction manager on very early on in the process, through the interview process, and negotiate what their fee is early on. Because, for an example, we had a project recently that, yes, there was a construction budget established very early on, but just as we know now, certain industries have tariffs on them and have cost increases, and it was the contractor that came in and said, okay, based on where we're heading, we're going to see a 20% increase in this product, and so on and so forth. How are we going to plan for that? And allowed us to be proactive while we're still in the design process, to have that kind of person on board to tell us what the increases were and proactively respond to them.
Correct. And I think the other thing that's really important, and the next slide sort of focuses a little bit on this, and if you have any takeaways from today, take this slide and go back and do a little research if you're considering a project, because I think it's very, very important for, at least we spend a lot of time educating our clients on the difference between a construction manager versus a general contractor. And the industry as a whole, unless you're an architect or an owner's rep or a general contractor, use general contractor and construction manager interchangeably. They just use those words interchangeably, but the reality is from a contractual standpoint, a delivery method standpoint, their ability to perform the functions are very, very different. Typically, a construction manager has very, very strong pre-construction skill sets that can help a project manage some of the costs and the risks on the very front end, and it's a very collaborative approach with the design team to make sure that Joe and his team is designing to the number that the general contractor knows they can deliver to, or the construction manager can deliver to. And so when you're looking at the different methods, delivery methods, this is a great graph that we use often with our clients to help them understand. What we're really trying to do is manage quality, manage cost, and manage time, and to create a balance between all of those. And each one of these delivery methods clearly defines what it's best suited for, and which leg of that three-legged stool is going to have an impact for the project. So do you want to get in the ground the quickest? Is it important that you open your doors in a specific time frame? Well, you know what? the schedule is very, very fast if you go with design build. If schedule is not a huge driver for you, then you may want to go with a general contractor or design bid build, where you're actually designing the project, you're bidding the project, and then you're building the project. So really understanding the balance of what you want to focus on, quality, cost, time, scope, feasibility, that will help drive which delivery method you should be focusing on.
There's a tremendous amount of external factors that help make these decisions as well. You might have a preferred method, but the economy, politics, marketing, other drivers can greatly influence what method you end up choosing to give you the most comfort at the end result of the project, so that you do balance quality, cost, and time.
That's right. And with that, we will open it up to questions, Liz. I'm sure there's
Sounds good. Well, thank you. We do have some questions for the panel. One question I think is more just a question on clarification from the last couple of slides that you guys had up there. And that is, could you explain what is design prime for anyone who's not familiar?
So typically that would be new construction. It is specifically suited for new construction or direct placement. It really is tied specifically to the construction contract, and it has a very, very limited number of trades. Typically that would be a project that would be smaller in scope.
Okay, thanks. Another question was if you could explain what a floating assisted living license is and how it works.
Okay, so it depends on the state and the country you're in, but the idea is that you design the building to meet assisted living regs, and it's marketed as independent living, and as a person ages in place and needs assistance, you could have a floating assisted living license that could allow care to be delivered under the assisted living guidelines to that specific unit. Now, that could also be achieved by a home health agency that you're contracted with that could be providing care for the residents as well. But it's certainly dependent upon the state that you're in that allows that to occur.
Yeah, every single state is different. As Jamie gave an example of the state that we were working in that had a certificate of need process for their assisted living license, there would not be any floating assisted living licenses. So each state has a different set of regulations and will drive whether you can have floating licenses or not. Arguably you could say that, even if you are in a CON state where they license the beds for assisted living, your ability to have a home care agency brought in and deliver services does create sort of that flexible environment.
And why that was created was when we went around the table and working with marketing consultants and listening to potential residents, the biggest concern, and when we were talking even to ourselves, is once I move into an environment that I really like because it's lifestyle-based, I don't want to have to move again. Mm-hmm. I want to live and age in place. Mm-hmm. So how do you allow that to occur? Well, you design the environment to allow that to occur. You look at not only the design of the unit, how technology can impact the design of that unit, allow a person to age with cognitive issues. You look at how you could deliver the care to it. You also look at, in that particular example, we created an area that was called the clubhouse, and it allowed for residents who have challenges with eating and socialization and some cognitive impairments to come down and participate in specialized programming and either mix when they choose to with the greater population or not. But it ultimately gives the flexibility back to the resident. And as Dana was saying, it's that resident's choice that's becoming more and more critical, especially for the boomers coming in. Mm-hmm. They're not going to want to be dictated to move through the continuum of care like we've been doing over the course of time. They're going to do what they want to do when they want to do it, or they're not going to move in.
And some of the clients that we work with, and this is more expensive, but some of the clients that we work with will design and develop and build their buildings to the licensed standards. And they'll license every unit for as many beds as they can get if there isn't a CON process. So, for example, in Michigan, if you're going to design to licensed homes for the aged standards, let's say you have a 50-unit building, they're all one-bedroom apartments, you could technically license it for 100 units or 100 beds, assuming that you're going to have couples in every single unit. We do have clients that will license every unit designed to the licensed homes for the aged standard, but maybe a resident will move in and they're still independent. To Joe's point, when they do need services, at least the building meets the license requirements and they can bring those services in. It does cost more in a lot of cases.
But we also are working with clients who want to foster change. So they are working with the government agencies to look at new ways of doing things. We have a client in Arizona that's doing that right now and really challenging them to push the envelope. And certainly it's an investment of time and energy and resources, but they feel the success of their community within the next 20 years is dependent upon coming up with a new model that will set them apart from others.
Thanks. I think you all have touched on this, but this is a question about what types of consultants you recommend using throughout this process. Maybe just if I could add to that for a bit of a different spin, but what are sort of the nice to have versus the need to have for somebody that's embarking on a new project?
Well, let me fire off my list, and then Joe, you can add anything that I missed. I honestly do believe that it's important to have an owner's rep there, somebody who can do this work, who does this work every single day. If you are an owner or an operator and you've never done a development, you need an owner's rep. Obviously, you've got to have an architect and a construction manager. You could get depending on the delivery method and the type of project, you could go with just a general contractor. I absolutely think you need to get someone at the table who can help you with how you're going to finance this project, whether you go directly with, some sort of a bank placement, or if you're going to go a bond route or some other alternative financing method, you're going to need to have an investment banker. You absolutely have to have someone who understands the market. So a market feasibility analyst is going to be critical, and I wouldn't just have them focus on what the actual demand is. I would have them look and spend a lot of time focusing on demographics, not only for the population that you're going to be serving, but potentially the population that you're going to attract as staff, and understanding that market area. I would also encourage you to have a market analyst that understands the home and community-based services environment, because that is going to continue to be a huge hot button for us, and probably in the very near future is going to be your number one competitor, because residents want to stay in their own home. So it's not just a matter of knowing what properties are in your market area that they might go to, but who are the home and community-based services that are allowing those residents to age in place. And then I would also say that another pretty important consultant is probably your civil engineer, particularly if you've got a complicated site or any entitlement issues. Watershed districts and floodplains can derail a project faster than you can shake a stick. I would say that a good kitchen consultant is very, very important. If you're providing, a comprehensive meal program, you want to make sure you get that designed right.
And that, it depends on the community, but the culinary arts can equate to, from an operating standpoint, up to 30 to 34 or 5% of your operational budget on a yearly basis. Okay. So getting that right early in the process is critical. I think the other one, and some owners have the capability of doing this themselves. Some need to seek some additional consultation as an operational consultant.
Yes.
Who can come in, and certainly Plante Moran has the ability to do the marketing and financial and operational feasibility assessments, but you may have someone that doesn't know all that. And what's important is that, again, even if you as the client understand it and may be an expert and it's working out perfectly in your community now, or the communities you have, and you're looking for a new one, there's always new ways of doing something that can meet the market demands or save money in the long run. So Operations, it's the upfront cost, but it's really the management of the property later on that will cost you long-term money. So I think getting all those pieces in place and asking those questions early on are important.
I thought another one too, and that is, the list is a million people long. Marketing.
Oh, a marketing consultant, yeah.
Especially if you're going in with an independent living or any sort of an entrance fee product, your ability to pre-lease those units, whether it's rental or entrance fee, is going to be absolutely critical. So making sure that people understand how to help you position for success is important. And if you're going to be doing any sort of fundraising for a particular project, a fund development analysis is also going to be equally as important.
Especially for the nonprofit providers.
Yep.
I think we have time for one more.
Liz, did you get that all written down?
Taking copious notes.
Yes.
What is the panel's opinion of securing capital for owner-operators with a great business plan and new vision for successful senior housing, but not able to finance a startup development themselves through traditional loan financing?
I missed that first part of the question.
Yeah,
can you repeat that?
Sure. What is the panel's opinion of securing capital for owner-operators with a great business plan and new vision for a successful senior housing development, but not able to finance a startup themselves through traditional financing?
I think there's a lot of options out there. It depends. The first thing they're going to look at is the success. If it's an existing operator, your historical success is going to be the first piece, particularly if you're looking at conventional financing. If that is throwing a wrench in the system, I think exploring joint ventures is something that needs to continue to happen a lot more frequently in the space. Certain owner-operators out there are unbelievably fantastic at doing it, and I think, but there are a significant number of senior living providers out there that are still thinking that they are essentially kind of the one-stop shop type organization, and they try to put everything under their roof, and by doing that, they don't allow for joint ventures, and they don't allow additional capital to come in that may be in form of equity or other forms of donation to the project. And so I think thinking a little bit more creatively along those lines has helped many of our clients get over some of those hurdles if they aren't able to get a project financed. If this is unique to more of a nonprofit organization, but if you're able to do capital fundraising, obviously that helps alleviate debt funding. If you are able to have access to private equity organizations, I think that also allows to alleviate the debt load, so you aren't loading up so significantly on debt. And I would say I just recently met an organization that functions as an additional form of financing, kind of like mezzanine debt, where you'd have your primary mortgage provider essentially is position one, then you'd have this mezz loan organization as the second position on the debt load. And the way they are able to get around it is it significantly reduces the amount of capital that an owner-operator needs to bring to the capital stack. If you're going conventional loan routes, you may be seeing quotes from your bank of 65, 70, 75% loan to value. These particular mezz loan organizations have come in and been able to fill that gap by bumping it up an additional 15 or 20%, which would reduce the equity needed by some of the owner-operators significantly, and it may help get the project across the finish line. With those organizations, though, you may see a pretty big variable with terms of the loan, and particularly length of time and the interest rate. And so make sure you get several quotes, and if you've never done it before, reach out to organizations who are able to help you kind of vet through that process, because that is going to be something you may see get information kind of all over the board.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we start to look at the boomers hitting the market, we're going to see a variety of types of models that may need to be created and or hybrid models. We know that there's obviously the rental models out there. We know there's entrance fee models. There may be a hybrid, like Dana, you've experienced a lot in Minnesota, the hybrid entrance fee rental model, small entrance fee with a rent associated with it. And we're starting to see more increase in equity models in the United States. It's very big internationally that we've had experience with, but we're starting to see that more in the States. So I think understanding what the model is first as well and how that plays into the financials of the project become critical.
Thanks. And then I think we just have one last question for Dana and Jamie. This question is, I believe, about the services that Plante Moran Living Forward office offers. Can you just give a brief overview of, working with you guys, what your services entail, what requirements might look like?
So I think working with us wise, if you know how to laugh, that's priority number one.
Yep.
I second that.
Real brief. Right. I would say you could break our services down into really four big buckets. Bucket one would be we help a lot at the very beginning stages with market feasibility, defining that product and what the community needs. Bucket two would be the financial feasibility work, which we touched on at the beginning of this project, to really make sure that at the end of the day the project can pencil out and makes financial sense. And it's not, oftentimes you may sit in that beginning phase of market and financial research and due diligence and modeling for up to a year potentially, running sensitivity after sensitivity to truly make sure that the project you're about to endeavor on and spend $30, $40, $50 million is really the correct project to move forward with. The third bucket would be our owner's rep services, where really we're going to act as that project manager throughout the entire development process, particularly helping organizations who want to make sure that, one, they may not be experienced in the development process, or two, just may be so busy with many of the other things happening within their entity that they want to use us as an extension of the staff, as their own staff throughout that entire construction process. And then the fourth component we help a lot of clients with is our operational consulting work, making sure that, one, the project we may be undergoing is operationally the most efficient, and then two, if you already have some existing operations and you just want to correct what's happening in your existing organization, we can help in that facet as well.
Okay, great. Well, I think that takes us to the end of our Q&A, and I just want to say a big thank you to our panel today and for our audience. As a reminder, the recording of the presentation and the slides will be sent out via email, so look out for that coming soon. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Liz.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.